really didn't want to be misquoted on that one. You have this perfect storm of the tragedies of the Jewish character coming over to this new land, and the tragedies of the Palestinian and Arab environment. Overlaid with that is also the fact that the Palestinians as a group of people really had been disempowered for a long time. Most of them did not own their own land. There was a lot of absentee owners from across the Middle East. So it was easy for the early Zionists to start trying to buy land away from landlords. And the shock to the Palestinians was that they were used to colonialism. They were used to people, they were used to empires. They were used to the Ottoman Turks. They were used to the British. They were used to the Syrians and the Egyptians and everybody laying claim to their area. They had no way to predict that in 1948 they'd be all forced out. Because that kind of ethnic cleansing didn't happen. This is why, transfer and ethnic cleansing is such a unique crime in history. It virtually wipes out indigenous peoples. Because there's this, how do you cope when everything that you've done is tied to the land? Your whole identity is tied to the land. I also think it's a perfect tragedy in the sense that as the Jews who came there did this to them, and like I've said, passed on the abuse, I've actually heard it said from various people that the Palestinians don't know how bad it could be. They didn't have it so bad. And I try to deconstruct that over time and understand, well, what is that? Why would you say that about 750,000 people out of their homes, 500 villages destroyed, the whole culture gone? Why would you say that that's not so bad? Well, because they weren't murdered. And so if you're used to being massacred in Europe, you look at this and say it's not so bad. They'll just set up shop somewhere else, like we did. You see how this is a perfect storm of bad relationships? And yet you have an indigenous people here that we're not used to. They were not, and then there were all sorts of romantic myths about the Arab in the Middle East and in Palestine. That they are nomadic, they're all Bedouin. Now Bedouin do move constantly. Not as much as people say they do, but they do move. So the Arab nomad made it even easier for the Europeans to think they'll just move somewhere else. And this was widely believed, not just among the Jews, but by all Europeans. They'll just move somewhere else because that's what, and they were redirecting populations all over the world at this time too. But this was really a belief. So it's a perfect storm of some very malicious people, but also some very decent people who were totally clueless about who the other was and didn't seem to have the skills to create a social contract that would extend to the other and treat them as equals. That's why I want to emphasize to you that in terms of the long view of conflict resolution, the future of the globe, it's not just enough to include the other in one's sense of moral categories. That's been done plenty with the sense that the other is inferior. Oh, we have to extend citizenship, and this happened in Europe with the Jews in the 18th century. We have to extend citizenship to them because then we can take them away from being thieves and we can civilize them. And that was a charitable European position. The uncharitable one is just let them go and kill them. But the charitable one was let's civilize them. Same thing in the United States in terms of the Native Americans. The transformation we have to look for in enemy relationships, and including in religious enemy relationships, is not just inclusion in a moral category. It has to be equality. There's no getting around this perhaps modern notion, but it also has religious roots of absolute equality. You can make the case from a variety of biblical texts and religious texts and different traditions for the notion that all human beings are created equal. You can make that case. You can also make the case from other texts that some are superior. You can make that case too. I don't see a future for humanity, secular and religious, without a social contract that implies absolute equality in terms of working out these very, very tough problems. There's no way, in my experience of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, that it will ever succeed unless both parties to the table feel that the other is an equal. And I rarely see that. Yeah.
Can we look to these Eastern philosophies and Buddhist philosophies of oneness and things of that nature for help in these concepts? Yeah. I mean, do they translate, or is it? I mean, it's a very sort of postmodern thing to start looking into, you know, Buddhist traditions and Zen meditation and yoga, right, and all of this. And but I mean, does it fall under the category of mysticism, like Kabbalah and Gnosticism, or does it come into place somewhere else? How does this translate into a Western Platonic society?
Well, I've been surprised by how pervasive in Israel at the front line of the conflict there are a lot of Eastern influences now, of yoga, of Buddhist thinking, including among the peacemakers. And it has had a beneficial impact. I think it's harder with the indigenous Arab population because any notion of anything foreign and borrowed is seen as a further insult. But that doesn't mean that there aren't indigenous roots of Sufi traditions and other traditions that can parallel that. That's why this is such a subtle and, I'm afraid, long process of not so much just internalization of somebody else's tradition, but the cross-fertilization that takes place in the mind when people start to begin to be more exposed to this. I think more and more that these Asian ideas have actually had a very powerful effect globally. I think if you repeat it enough that the Dalai Lama appreciates the Chinese for him teaching him patience, you start to see parallels of other people feeling that way. You know, odd things like how many of the most moderate people in the Palestinian camp have spent time in Israeli prisons learning Hebrew and understanding the Israelis from within. I mean, that's a parallel. It's just, if you say it as Buddhist, then it's yet another trick of the West and the colonialists to get us to not fight back. And you got to be very careful about how you name things. If you say it as Buddhist, then all sorts of religious Jews are off the table. They're not going to accept it as that. So I've taken to having multiple languages when I speak, depending on who I'm speaking to. And if I were to talk about the interconnectedness or interdependence, and I've introduced at various places the shocking idea, it's just the way the human mind works. We sort of, plagiarism is almost part of our nature, which is okay. And it's a kind of, we kind of internalize things. So I remember speaking to some African students at one point in my trainings years ago, and I looked at them, and they were from Liberia, Rwanda, a few other places, and I said to them, you have so much to teach the world. And I knew what I was doing. I was reversing roles. But I was also talking about interdependence, and because I firmly have come to believe that the radical Tibetan notion that this worm is probably my grandmother is very radical, but it teaches something about radical interdependence. For me, it's that I need everyone on all sides to realize that they need each other. That's the way I've internalized that Buddhist notion. And the African students just sat there and they just laughed at me. They were just too shocked because no Westerner had ever said that there was a wisdom tradition from them that could possibly teach anybody else about conflict resolution or culture. And that laugh was one of the most tragic things I've ever seen, because it was just layers of history, you know. And I'm sorry to say Christianity too, because they were Christian, and their Christianity taught them that their own indigenous cultures were the work of the devil. That doesn't mean I love all the different local cultures, but I certainly know that they're not the work of the devil, and that people have wisdom that's been buried. So it was a very tragic laugh, but I was using a Buddhist idea without saying it was a Buddhist idea. And I think that that's the way the globe is. So I've said this before. When I have the right moment, I try to introduce to an Israeli audience that you really need the Palestinians if you ever really want to live here truly. If you ever really want to survive in the Middle East, if you really want to understand this land, you need to. You know, and the first reaction will be laugh and everything. But now, as the environment is falling apart in Israel, and the swamps that they drained, they were so proud of the swamps that they drained, because the Arabs lived with the swamps all those centuries, but we drained them and made land, and now it turns out that it was the worst environmental disaster they could have pulled. You know, and you know, things are evolving, and I do think that over time there would be a greater rapprochement and integration if it were not for the violence of the relationship. Unfortunately, the violence of the relationship trumps all these other constructive, interdependent approaches, because the people are just afraid of each other for two very legitimate reasons. And that's where, that's why it's so tough to do this work. But I am firmly believing that the Buddhist notions are actually starting to penetrate the kind of things I say and the kind of things that many people have said. And I didn't take Thich Nhat Hanh seriously until I saw it in somebody's library who I trusted in Jerusalem. He was reading Thich Nhat Hanh, so I mean, you know, this was 15 years ago already. So it's very interesting to see the cross-cultural ways in which things are moving. Okay, so we'll continue with this next time.